Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the far-ranging controversy that has arisen in the wake of the killing of Charlie Kirk and a debate in the United Kingdom's House of Lords over euthanasia. I'm joined by Frawley and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. Often the motives of assassins are unclear, but we continue to get evidence about what led Tyler Robinson to shoot Charlie Kirk. He inscribed anti-fascist messages on bullets. His mother informed the government that her son had recently become more pro-gay and trans rights oriented. Robinson told his romantic partner, a trans-identified male, that he had had enough of Kirk's hatred and that some hate can't be negotiated out. Given the available information, it's unsurprising that many voices have seen the killing as reflecting a problem in the culture of the left, and we've now seen a wide-ranging response to the murder based on that conclusion. Geoff, you've been watching things as they develop. What do you think is going to change in the wake of Charlie Kirk's death?
So it does seem to be one of these cultural watersheds. Various people have compared it to George Floyd and said it's the right's George Floyd moment. I think that's a reasonable comparison that ties to an analysis I've been developing since the election last year of what I'm calling viral hegemony, which is a sort of speed run towards a certain kind of cultural dominance passing through social media. So I won't go into that much, but it's clear that, and the main way that this is sort of being debated and hashed out is that the right, in some cases, openly is now embracing, what it once derided as cancel culture, is saying that, it's time for essentially a kind of comeuppance, or in this somewhat sort of pretentious argument that I sometimes see deployed and have seen for a year or two now, this is a sort of game theory strategy of tit for tat, where we can end cancel culture precisely by engaging it and embracing it, so that it brings about a kind of equilibrium between the two sides of the culture. So anyway, I think that's at least how it's being justified by people who, once thought that cancel culture was the greatest abomination in history, are now sort of saying, well, it's great to get people fired for, posting dumb things about Kirk's death. So, there's a lot here that's just very familiar in terms of the culture wars of the past decade. The question that you brought up, Matthew, of, does this say something about the culture of the left? I think this is a difficult question to answer, in part because we clearly have certain types of kind of spectacular media-oriented violence in American life. For a long time, the dominant form of that was the mass shooting, and there were various attempts to kind of politicize it and try to, blame it or associate it with one side of the culture. And I'd say, particularly from the left of the culture, you had the claim that the mass shooting was somehow emblematic of white supremacy and things like this. And none of that was ever very persuasive, in my view, because mass shootings were kind of a remarkable phenomenon in that if you looked at the sort of racial ethnic makeup of perpetrators of mass shootings. It really did actually map onto that of the country as a whole. There was a kind of representative character of it. And I'd say that was also true of ideology. The mass shootings were carried out by people of a great array of ideologies, and in many cases, no discernible one at all. And so I suppose one thing that's kind of interesting about this, and so we have had, as I wrote about in the Substack last week, people can check it out at the Compact Substack, but I wrote about what it means that the figure of the assassin and the act of assassination of public figures, or in the case of Brian Thompson, the United Health CEO, assassinated last year, not really a public figure, but let's say a prominent, powerful figure. There's clearly some kind of significance to this shift back towards assassinations, which are capturing more of public attention. Even as mass shootings are continuing to happen, there was a mass shooting that occurred in Colorado, a state over from where the Kirk assassination occurred, just within an hour of that event. Obviously, one of them is commanding a great deal more attention. So public attention has shifted to this type of event. It's a type of event that, in American history has often been, I'd say, more kind of politically legible. Although, of course, if you think of the most famous and archetypal assassination, the JFK assassination, what's strange about it is that its history has been this kind of collapse into illegibility, where something that might seem relatively straightforward actually turns out to be, where you have a self-identified communist assassinating a Cold War era president. Nonetheless, it turns out to be this kind of bizarre phantasmagoria of every conceivable ideological explanation for this assassination. So the point is, I think assassinations, because they're targeting singular figures rather than just random civilians, they tend to have a clearer kind of symbolic weight. And nonetheless, it's interesting that we still don't seem to know much of anything about Thomas Crooks, who was the attempted assassin of Donald Trump during the campaign last year. So he is kind of one of these enigmatic assassins who are a sort of feature of American political history, where their motives are, even if their target conveys a certain clear political and symbolic valence, their motives are seemingly inscrutable. So in the case of this, we seem to have a relatively clear-cut motive that a decent amount of evidence is piling up for. And so then the question is what that means more broadly. And I suppose one way to think about this is, there's been this attempt to claim that this has something to do with a group called Armed Queers Salt Lake City. And I have no idea whether there's anything to that association. But, clearly we have some assassinations in American history where they were carried out by people who had a kind of broader base in civil society. I would point here to the assassination of Medgar Evers, which occurred in the same era as the major assassinations of JFK, RFK, Martin Luther King. So the assassin of Medgar Evers was a member of a white citizens council. So he was, essentially part of this broader kind of movement within the South to oppose desegregation and to sort of defend states' rights as they defined it, to maintain segregated spaces. And so in this case, we have an assassin who manifested a politics that had a broader base in civil society. And so there are some assassins who are like that. There are others like Oswald who was not really like that. So even though he was a communist, he wasn't really a member of any organization or somebody who was tied to left-wing organizing. And so to me, the question is, it seems so far that this assassin may have simply acted on his own. And in that case, I think, the best way that we can respond to it is simply to see a prosecution that, attempts to reveal his motives. But I think what the right is attempting to do is, again, tie this to a kind of broader base in civil society, and therefore use it as a point to galvanize opposition to or a kind of war. There were these kind of declarations of war against a broad array of enemies, and we're seeing this in the form of this kind of organized effort to get people fired who posted things that are, offensive to conservative fans of Charlie Kirk in the wake of his assassination. And we see it in the most recent development, which is a sort of threatening response by the FCC chairman over a, quite dumb set of statements by the comedian and host Jimmy Kimmel the other day, which led his network to sack him and cancel his show. So I think, we are seeing a kind of response to this that is, again, a kind of broad-based effort to target what are seen as the kind of broader bases of support for an endorsement of this act of political violence. So, I tend to think that will go badly in various ways. But the thing that's probably most striking to me is just the kind of top-down nature of this version of a kind of cancel culture, where you actually have the vice president and other, prominent leaders sort of encouraging people to essentially, snitch on anyone they see posting these things, to contact their employers and so on. So this is something that we didn't really see previously in terms of the kind of systematicity of the effort. I think the previous kind of era of high point of cancellations was this much more kind of mob-like or sort of swarm-like spontaneous set of developments, whereas here we see it being much more coordinated. And so that's, I think it brings us to a novel moment, and it I think is going to lead to a kind of people don't generally like snitches, so I think that it's not going to assist in maintaining, what I've been calling this viral hegemony to go to this level. I think it is going to end up producing some sort of cultural backlash, but at least in the long run. In the short run, I think it's going to have quite a bit of impact in terms of, both. It seems that already, maybe hundreds of people have been like fired from jobs over this. So it's on a scale that's, possibly greater than anything that we saw at the kind of high point of 2010s cancellations.
Sir, can I just ask? You said that you think there's going to be a backlash. Do you mean this will kind of see cancel culture out the door?
Well, it's a good question. I sort of think we've already seen multiple phases of this. It seems to me, that there was a kind of discovery, roughly around 2012 to 2014 of the potential to use social platforms to, essentially create these kind of mob dynamics that could be used to sort of ruin people. if you read the book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, it sort of covers the early era of that, the book by John Ronson. And then I think in certain ways it became sort of and that early phase was not entirely politically clear. It involved people it involved people who weren't necessarily saying particularly political things, and who weren't being canceled by any particularly clear political force. So then it I think gains a sort of progressive valence in certain ways as the 2010s wear on. And then that produces a kind of backlash and vibe shift. And now it seems to me that we're seeing we're seeing a kind of backlash to that that has become more intense and sort of vicious and kind of vengeful and vindictive. But I guess the question is whether whether we slowly come to some kind of equilibrium. I think the thing that strikes me about this is that we suddenly reached a point where people could, something like 15 years ago, where people could just sort of post random thoughts and have them seen by the entire country or the entire world. And that had just not been the case before. And so that raises all kinds of problems. If you think about what life was like before that, if someone has a job, they say something at drinks after work, it offends or ruffles some feathers, and then, eventually they get fired or their contract doesn't get renewed. That's a kind of thing that clearly happened all the time, and but was sort of not seen as a public affair. And so, what happens when you can just kind of put your casual brain farts online all the time is that those kind of incidents take on a different significance and become part of public discourse, both the thing you say and then the response to it. And so it seems to me, there's just kind of a question of like mores and social norms and the way that they haven't really adjusted to this new reality. For a while, I thought, we were seeing this kind of fragmentation of social media into different silos, the kind of fracturing that, there wasn't just like one big space anymore, but people were kind of distributed across various different platforms. And so this made it harder for people to become the main character of the day, as was often the case in the 2010s. And so I thought maybe that would lead to some sort of resolution of this problem, that the kind of the fracturing and fragmentation of online space would just resolve some aspects of this, because it would be harder to magnify these things into something that would actually capture the imagination of the whole society. So I think that's still kind of what's going on to some extent, but what's happening at the moment is that you have, people in power who are using their bully pulpit to shine light on and shift public attention towards this particular set of statements. So I don't know. I mean, I think gradually, some of these things are just going to work themselves out as a kind of question of like shared social norms, but that's probably just always going to be volatile because of the shifting technological and sort of communications landscape.
I really appreciate that optimism because for me, I have been so dejected the past week at this response. It was just so disgusting. And I'm on Facebook, as you are, millennial. And it's just like everybody on Facebook who vaguely considers themselves a leftist was like all celebratory. And I was sitting there like, and they're like, well, he was violent. And I was like, oh, please, I didn't realize he was violent. Tell me all the violent acts he committed. Words are violence. Words are violence. And I was like, oh God. Somebody commented, live by the sword, die by the sword. I was like, words are not swords. Like, this is just really, really frustrating. It's just what I get for debating normies, I guess. I don't know. But then you go on to X, and it's literally the exact same thing. This is what everybody is saying about, being canceled for celebrating, words are violence, freedom of speech is not freedom from consequences, which is what the left was saying about Charlie Kirk. And I was like, this is it. Where is liberalism? Where is the faith in democracy and freedom of speech? It's, there's a complete lack of belief um, in any kind of liberal values, like any sense that you can convince other people. It's just like, no one is ever convinced. Talking is pointless. And that was, to me, really, really scary. The fact that I saw almost nobody question that. I saw like probably the only principled response I saw was from Toby Young. And I was glad to see it. But boy, people were jumping all over that. And I suppose it's just the nature of the beast. But the idea that, this is the internet and our ability to say whatever we want, whenever we want, is pretty new. And we might just work it out. And I really like that optimistic stance. We might kind of say, look, enough is enough. We just get exhausted by tracking people down and finding their employers. We just won't have the appetite for it eventually. And I hope it kind of works out and becomes more of a public square when we get over this ability to vent our powerlessness and other aspects of our lives and be like, here we go. Here I am. I have this thing in my hands, and now I'm going to be able to make you pay for everything that's wrong in my life. Maybe that will pass. I really like that. But the thing that really concerned me, I think, was I was reading the text message exchange between Tyler Robinson, the alleged, are we still saying alleged shooter, and his roommate / boyfriend. And the one thing that I thought was really interesting first was how we somehow went in the space of, I don't know, 5 years from like, it's okay to be gay to, I'm reading between the lines heavily here, but essentially, you will affirm that my boyfriend is actually my girlfriend, or I will literally shoot you. I mean, like the idea that he said, this kind of hate can't be negotiated out. And it struck me that, I don't know, I just got this sort of like homophobic vibe from the whole thing. And I'm just obviously responding to vibes. But the other thing that I noticed was how ironically detached he seemed to be from the fact that he had just killed a man, possibly in front of his wife and children. Possibly. I don't know if that's, I had heard that at some point. But anyways, in front of the world, he just took a man's life. And he's still talking in this ironic internet speak detachment. He said something like, if I see notices bulge ooh on Fox News, I think I might have a stroke. Like he did it for the lulz, that this was like the ultimate act of trolling. And oh my God, Fox News is going to put that on Fox News. Like you just killed a man. It was just incredibly striking, the immaturity and the detachment that is so much a feature of the online world leaking into the real world. And that was really concerning.
So I was just going to add something interesting, contextual. He is from southern Utah, which I've spent a bit of time in. It's a very conservative part of the country. Utah is one of the most Republican states in the country, and that whole region, Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, is also defined by Mormon, the Mormon Church. This is and I suppose something I found kind of interesting was, this is not one of these sort of, I don't know, broken home, messed up. Like he seems to come from a functional household, to be from a kind of, a community. And I mean, I've spent a decent amount of time in Utah, and that it's a very kind of civically healthy society overall. And that they are kind of these people are not bowling alone for the most part, right? They're sort of they're actually like very well integrated with each other and communities, and the Mormon Church is very good at creating kind of functional structures for individuals and families. And so it's interesting to me that he comes out of that world. And I was just on a podcast with Shadi Hamid and Damir Marusic, the Wisdom of Crowds podcast, and they brought up the idea, and so we were talking about all this, but they brought up the idea that you might compare this to a kind of honor killing. And so this, I think, in terms of Ashley, your sort of point about, how do we get from the idea that, you must affirm this or you will die. There's a way, I think, and I believe it was Damir who brought up this idea that, you could kind of tie this back to some notion, some very primordial and sort of primitive notion of an honor killing that, I think we can see this person, again, I'm extrapolating a lot, but as, being in a very conflicted situation, which is that he's in this very conservative, patriarchal and frankly, I hate to use the phrase, but heteronormative culture, which is like Utah Mormonism. It 100% is. If you go to an LDS household, have almost all of them, like on the fridge, will have this document that's called like the Declaration on the Family, which is essentially a kind of restatement of the, and I believe it was directly, in response to the rise of gay marriage. So it's a restatement of, marriage is between a man and a woman, and the family is what it is and is ordained that way by God. So this is a culture that I think it's fair to describe as heteronormative. And so, he exists in that world and is apparently, he's not estranged from his family, at least in any sort of radical way. And yet, he's also developed this other connection that puts him completely at odds with that in a very fundamental way. And so that, again, I'm extrapolating and speculating a lot, but the thing that interests me here and that I think connects to some kind of notion of an honor killing, or often what happens is, that there's someone in the family who gets into a relationship that is disapproved of by the community, and then that person is killed, right? Or the person has let's say a daughter of a family has a lover from outside the community, from the wrong religious group, or the wrong kinship network. And so then there is violence to kind of to end that kind of violation of endogamy. And so, what's interesting here is it goes in a slightly different direction. It's that he is targeting somebody who, is a prominent representative of the world, of roughly the kind of political and social worldview of like his family and community that is at odds with his own kind of personal choices. And so, violence is being used to kind of settle that, or to attempt to settle that conflict between one set of values and another. And so I found that very interesting, that this idea that you could kind of connect it to, even though it seems like this kind of very weird, very online kind of phenomenon, that you could also connect it to this very, again, sort of primitive form of violence, which is the honor killing. So I'm curious whether you find that convincing.
Yeah, it could easily be both at the same time, because consciously he may be acting in a particular way when below the surface, what he's essentially doing is enacting some kind of much older ritual. And I do think that a lot of this anti-fascism is doing the work of some much, much deeper cultural or societal obsession or absence or something like that. That, I don't know, for a lot of young people, there's a loss of meaning, a loss of purpose, a sense that, there's no real moral compass to guide you. There is obviously to a certain extent, but, and I always say this, like, I remember what it was like being a teenager and just really being uncertain about how I was supposed to behave and what I was supposed to become, and just like wanting clear rules. And I couldn't find any of these clear rules. And I'd ask my dad, like, what should I be? I'm thinking of what am I going to do when I finish high school? And my dad's like, do whatever makes you happy. And I'm like, what the hell does that mean? Like, I don't know what the hell that means. So I would I'd read like self-help books and stuff. And I was like, these people know, right? They've done the science. There's got to be something. So there's like this real sort of vacuum when it comes to a figure that you can look to or some kind of tradition. And I think a lot of people will find it. And we've got a good piece by Ryan Zitgraf in today, Thursday, 18th of September, called Labubu Nation, where he talks about this, where he says, kidults buying Labubus is just the other side of the coin of this like permanent adolescence of Andrew Tateism, where they become trapped in this adolescence where they're looking for a figure, they're looking for something that will be a symbol. I suppose like Labubu's less so, but Andrew Tate definitely could give you this kind of symbol of like, well, here's what I'm supposed to do. If I do this, then this will happen. Or Jordan Peterson, like clean your room. These people, they became powerful because they filled that. I know everybody has said this, but they filled that vacuum of having a sense of certainty, a sense of moral authority that the kind of cool Gen X parent evacuated. And I think for like fascism or anti-fascism, like this is the ultimate place where morality has kind of gone, where it's like, well, what was evil? Like evil is not Satan anymore. Evil is Hitler. And so what is the greatest good that you could do? You could become an anti-fascist. But there's like no real sense of what fascism is. It's just becomes this stand-in for the word evil. And so it's this weird moving target. So just to give an example of this, and I bet you this person will listen to this, and I hope he does. I don't know. I don't think so, because he doesn't seem the type to read or listen to anything. But I just tweeted, I wrote on X a post where I was like, oh, isn't it funny that pretty much everything is fascist except shooting people who disagree with you, industrial slaughter, or so like industrial killing of ill and disabled people. And whatever, just everything gets called fascist except things that are like quite clearly fashy. And it got shared all over the place, and it got shared by somebody on Instagram, and I've been getting death threats like nobody's business from this post. And this guy is messaging me, and I'm the type of look, I am a liberal at heart. Like I want to sublate liberalism. I want to make it real. I want to make it possible. And so I have this really bad habit of engaging with people. So this guy's telling me I'm a fascist and fascists have to die. And I'm like, well, tell me more about that. Tell me, what's a fascist to you? And it was such an interesting exchange, because I had never, outside of an Arendt analysis, seen somebody speak almost entirely in cliches before. Like almost, he asked me at one point, well, what is a woman? And I start talking about like gender and biology, giving the standard sociological response. And he goes, no, that's a non-answer. A woman is anyone who identifies as a woman. I was like, what? You think that's like, oh, I got you. Here's the throwdown answer no one's ever said before. Anyway, so I asked her, I was like, I figured this guy must be young. Maybe he's just starting out on his political path. And I'm like, you should read some fascist literature. Have you ever read any fascist literature? Because he's telling me I'm a fascist, right? And I need to die. Like he's quite serious about this, that he's ready to kill fascists. That's the most important thing he's going to do. And I'm one of them. And I'm like, well, have you read fascist literature? And he says, no. Why the F would I read any of that? And I was like, you're ready to pick up a gun, but not a book? You want to know this thing that you hate so much? And I even suggested some literature, like I suggested Ishai Lando, which I think these are really good books, on fascism and the masses. And these are, and he's completely uninterested, because he's just responding to a meme. It's like this sort of memification of history. All I know is that fascism stands for evil, and you're evil. And he has this like vague understanding that fascists dehumanize people. Well, fascists dehumanize trans people, and that's the most dehumanizing thing you can do. So that makes them. I can't remember his little twisted logic. Oh, it's funny. I can't even put it out again. It was so twisted, but it was like that means that you're not human. That was the logic, and I was like, you're dehumanizing people. No, they're dehumanizing more. So therefore, they must die. And it was just utterly mad. And it was not the only one. I had a whole bunch of these kind of weird messages. And I was just thinking like, well, these are young men who are lost. They're the other side of Andrew Tate. Some will gravitate to Andrew Tate, and Andrew Tate's going to tell them how to get laid. And some of them are going to gravitate to this weird memeified anti-fascism, which just literally was just a whole bunch of internet posts. That's what this guy was. That's all he'd apparently read. And that's going to lead him to being better than he is. It's going to give him a quest in life. It's going to make him good. And it strikes me as a real disconnection from not only the legacy of political movements, the disconnection from history and understanding of what fascism actually was. And we were going to talk, I think, about assisted dying. I'm not sure, but it's a very similar thing that I've been noticing with assisted dying, is that because I've been so steeped in this and studying this for such a long time, I've gone back and read some of that early eugenics literature, stuff from the early 1920s. And I know that it all started with people choosing to die, and that it was all about freedom of choice, and life unworthy of life was about, these are lives that you wouldn't choose yourself, but people imagine that it was it all started with propaganda, because it's what you learn in high school, I guess. It's just like Nazis riled up the masses and somebody did a little dance, and then masses went, ooh, I'm feeling a little bit murdery, and that's what happened, right? That's it. That's what people know. They know about dehumanization. They know somebody gave a riling speech and the masses all went, woo, and lost control. And that's kind of the extent of it. And they don't understand that, people back then are just like us now. You're not special. Like, a lot of these arguments were very powerful. They were very convincing. Especially to educated people, students to doctors. They sounded very leftist. They were powerful on the left as well. And so, people do not understand like the full nuance of what actually happened there, and we're left just with memes. And when you're just responding to memes, and people won't touch it either, because it's become this untouchable aspect of history. You'd never read Mein Kampf. Oh, are you one of these people that say go read Mein Kampf? Go read all these people. Go read like Evola. Go read, I don't know, people who are like proto-fascists, Pareto. These are all extremely important and interesting people for how they represent this kind of frustrated liberalism that bled over into a deep, deep anti-humanism. And this is exactly what is happening amongst these young men, amongst these young people, that they start out as liberals and they become more and more frustrated. Why won't you just do what is right? Why won't you just hold the right ideas? Why won't you just say what you are supposed to say? And they become more and more illiberal, which is exactly the path that many liberals trekked in the past. So through my kind of weird example there, I think that what a lot of these people are doing is a misguided quest for a goodness, when all of that is gone, and all that they have is the memification of history, where they can kind of pull up some moral values, and they think have a quest and a meaning in life. And it's ironic and so illiberal, and I don't really know what to do about it, because I tried and I failed. I failed completely. He was not interested in reading or responding to anything I had to say. And obviously it's just one person, but I feel like it's reflective of a lot of our culture. But tell me I'm reading too much into it. I don't know. Because it's hard, because the stuff is getting into policy as well. This illiberalism, the anti-free speech, the assisted dying, all of this illiberal stuff. And I'm dejected.
The particular context is the debate over the assisted dying legislation in the UK continues. We published Dan Hitchens on that earlier this week, the nihilism of Andrew Roberts. So, I mean, one question is, I think a lot of people who, and it's been interesting to me. There was a long piece about, the euthanasia in Canada in the Atlantic magazine recently. I don't know if you saw this, but it was pretty dark. And my sense was that actually a lot of sort of liberals in the US are reading about this and are actually quite horrified by it. And so I guess maybe that's good. Maybe it suggests that.
Yeah, well, that's why nobody wants you to talk about Canada.
That American liberals are really have some kind of have some kind of ability to discern what's gone wrong here. But maybe to wrap up and just to mention to the audience, Matthew was called away, so I am I am filling in as host in our final moments. So just maybe briefly tell us what's happening in the UK on that front, and how you see it going at this point.
Yeah, it's really concerning because it seems as though there's that contingent of like edgy leftists, good edgy. When I say edgy, I usually mean it in like an ironic way, but I mean, leftists who were not afraid to come out and say things and have principles and so on. I don't know where they are, but there's some of them who have been coming out against this, and that's been important. But I worry that if a proponent of assisted dying legislation succeed in framing anti-assisted dying as a weird right-wing religious thing, then we're just cooked. It's over. But I think so. Yeah, it's gone through. It's passed. I think the first and second readings, and now it's in the House of Lords being debated. And there's some talk of people in the House of Lords totally like vetoing the legislation, but that would be very, very unlikely. But you'd think in a situation like this, when so much is at stake, they might do. I don't know. I hold out hope. But one thing that caused a big uproar over the last day or so was a piece in the New Statesman by Ollie Dugmore called "Let Them Die: The Case for Assisted Dying," which essentially talked about, how bad it is for older people and how we treat them really poorly and it's extremely expensive, and essentially like saying the quiet part out loud, right? Everyone's talking about, oh, it's freedom and freedom of choice. And in the background, it's like the societal horror at the prospect of being useless, the societal horror at being disabled, at becoming old. And this just kind of lays it out, like it really, without any self-awareness, basically says, "Ew!" Like when I go, I'm being mean, but it's so hard for me to take a step back from this issue. But it's like, oh, you see these people in the care homes, and you're like, oh, that's not a good life, and you don't want to be sitting there on a drip watching daytime TV, and it's just, this sense like that's never going to be me kind of thing. And if it was, ew, just off me. And it was just so disgusting, so such a bare cost benefit analysis that it really caused, at least online, an uproar. I mean, if you have any kind of moral compass, it ought to have made you feel a little bit sick to your stomach. This idea of like, let them die, let old people die. And somebody commented online like, well, we do. It's pretty bad in these care homes. Like, we don't have proper care facilities for people. And someone says, well, yeah, I agree. Like, we treat old people appallingly, but I don't think the answer is to liquidate them en masse. Like, and it's really amazing if you can. And this is really the logic. Can you imagine if you were looking at, all the suffering in the world, all the horrible lives that people live, all the poverty, all the agony, and all the people who want to die, and you're like, yeah, we should kill them. Like, that's really the response, that people are looking at all this and they're like, yeah, we should really kill these people. It's it's an incredible end of history, and this is all there is. This is as good as it's going to get, kind of thing. And I would just direct people to, a compact piece that I wrote recently called "The World Without People" to kind of get a little bit of a sense of what I think is some of the underlying economics behind this. But that piece just kind of laid it bare. Look, you're not useful anymore. And you living longer means that there's going to be less of an inheritance for your children. Just do the right thing and die. And how is it that we are like so worried about there's no alternative to capitalism, right? All the alternatives were so awful. Like, look, we had Nazism and state-sponsored killing. And look, we had the Soviet Union and authoritarianism. So there's no alternative to this. Well, what are you so afraid of? Capitalism brought all this stuff already. It needed no help from socialism. It needed no help from National Socialism. It's here. So I think we need to start thinking, are we really going to start? Do we really want to do cost benefit analyses between the NHS and your life? Really? Are we going to say the NHS is more important than human life? You're going to we went from like save the NHS to like off granny for the NHS. Let's have some perspective here. Where are we going? What is this all for? What are we doing this for? And now is the time to start asking ourselves, is this really okay? Is this really the world we want to live in?
And with that, please go to compactmag.com/subscribe to read all of our articles. Thanks, Ashley, and thank you, Matthew, who again was called away. And we will talk to you next week.